The throbbing pain in my right leg was nothing compared to the sharp, sudden sting of those words. I was sitting in my own kitchen, confined to a wheelchair, with a heavy plaster cast wrapped around my fractured tibia. My throat was completely parched. It had been 3 weeks since my terrible fall down the wooden staircase, an accident that still felt strange and blurry to my memory. I had simply rolled into the kitchen to ask for a drink. It was a simple request, really. Just a single glass of cold water. My daughter-in-law, Monica, was lounging on the expensive Italian leather sofa just a few feet away from the kitchen island. She was swiping aggressively on her tablet, her manicured nails clicking loudly against the glass screen. She did not even bother to look up from her device when I spoke. "Get up and get your own water, you crippled old man," she snapped. Her voice cut through the quiet morning like a jagged knife, dripping with absolute disgust. "I am not your damn servant. If you want a drink so badly, get down on the floor and crawl for it." The silence that followed her outburst was completely deafening. The only sound in the massive room was the gentle hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. I slowly turned my head, looking past the grand marble countertops. My son Derek was standing barely 6 feet away from me. He was meticulously pouring himself a cup of dark roast coffee. He did not flinch at his wife and her cruel words. He did not turn around to defend me. He just kept pouring, staring intensely at the black liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. He was pretending he had heard absolutely nothing. This was my own flesh and blood. The little boy I had carried on my shoulders at the community park. The grown man whose $120,000 credit card debt I had completely paid off just 12 short months ago. He had come to me crying back then, begging for help, because the bank was going to take his home. I wrote the check without a second thought to save him. And now he could not even find the courage to hand his injured 79-year-old father a glass of tap water. If you are watching this story right now, I need you to take a deep breath. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of betrayal from the very people you sacrificed your entire life for? If you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and treated your kindness as a weakness, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below what city or state you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Your support gives me the strength to share this dark chapter of my life. Because what I am about to tell you is a story of how unchecked greed can turn a family into absolute monsters, and how a quiet old man orchestrated the most devastating revenge they never saw coming. I sat there in the wheelchair, gripping the cold metal rims of the wheels until my knuckles turned white. A younger man, a more foolish man, might have yelled. I might have demanded respect. I might have reminded them both that they were standing in my $4.2 million home in Seattle. A beautiful estate they had begged to move into 2 months ago, claiming they wanted to care for their aging, widowed father after my severe accident. But at my age, after running a massive corporate supply chain for 40 years, you learn that anger is a loud and clumsy weapon. Silence is far more lethal. I did not say a single word. I simply stared at my son and his broad back for a long, heavy moment. I let the reality of his cowardice burn itself deeply into my memory. Then, with a slow, agonizing effort, I pushed the wheels of my chair backwards. The faint squeak of the rubber tires on the pristine hardwood floor was the only sound I made as I turned around and wheeled myself out of the kitchen. My throat was still burning with thirst, but my heart had turned entirely to ice. Every push of the wheel sent a sharp jolt of pain up my shattered leg, but my mind was incredibly clear. It all made perfect sense now. The subtle eye rolls when I asked for assistance. The heavy sighs when I needed to be taken to my physical therapy appointments. The way Monica constantly complained about the cost of my medical care, completely ignoring the fact that my own money was paying for everything. They did not move in to take care of me. They moved in to wait for me to pass away. And from the vicious look in Monica and her eyes this morning, she was getting very impatient. I spent the rest of the day locked inside my private study, staring out the large bay windows at the gray sky. I did not eat lunch. I did not ask for water again. I just sat in the quiet room piecing together every strange occurrence over the past few weeks. The misplaced financial mail. The hushed conversations that abruptly stopped whenever I entered a room. The way Derek had eagerly offered to manage my daily banking tasks so I would not have to stress about paying the bills. I had handed over the keys to my daily life out of blind trust. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across my study, I made my decision. They thought I was finished. They thought I was just a senile burden taking up space in a house they already considered their own. But they forgot who built this empire. When the house was finally completely quiet, and I knew they were fast asleep in the upstairs master bedroom, I slowly reached into the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk. I bypassed my normal smartphone. Instead, I pulled out a cheap prepaid cell phone I kept hidden for emergencies. I dialed a number I had known by heart for over 20 years. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Bradley." I whispered into the receiver, making sure my voice would not carry past the thick wooden doors. "It is Harrison. I need you to start drafting some legal documents immediately. They think I am just a crippled, useless old man who is going to fade away quietly." I paused, feeling a cold smile stretch across my face in the darkness. "I am going to take everything from them, Bradley, and I need you to help me do it." The next morning, the perfect illusion of their wealthy lifestyle began to crack, and before they even realized what was happening, everything they had completely fell apart. Before that morning arrived, I had to survive the night. The disconnected phone line clicked loudly in the darkness of my study. I locked the cheap device securely in the drawer. My throat was still completely dry. The burning sensation had grown significantly worse over the last few hours, a harsh physical reminder of the utter humiliation I endured earlier that morning. I needed water desperately, and this time I knew better than to ask anyone in this house for help. I placed my wrinkled hands on the cold metal rims of my wheelchair and pushed myself forward with a heavy sigh. Navigating my home in the dead of night felt exactly like trespassing. The massive Mercer Island estate, which I built from the ground up, was now shrouded in heavy shadows. Every single push of the wheels sent a fresh wave of pure agony shooting up my right leg. The thick plaster cast felt like a solid concrete block dragging me down. I gritted my teeth tightly, suppressing a groan as the wheelchair bumped against the edge of an imported Persian rug. The physical pain was sharp and relentless, but it was nothing compared to the deep ache expanding in my chest. Betrayal from a business rival is just a paper cut. Betrayal from your own son is a rusty knife twisting slowly between your ribs. I finally reached the wide entrance of the kitchen. The polished hardwood floors gleamed faintly under the pale moonlight, spilling through the large bay windows. The kitchen was massive, a professional chef's dream equipped with custom mahogany cabinets and pristine marble countertops. I wheeled myself slowly over to the deep stainless steel sink. Because I was confined to the chair, I was sitting much lower than usual. I had to stretch my upper body awkwardly upward, balancing on my one good leg, just to reach the cabinet where we kept the everyday drinking glasses. My shoulder muscles burned with the sudden effort. My trembling fingers brushed the smooth glass, but I slipped. The crystal tumbler fell bouncing once loudly on the marble counter before I managed to catch it clumsily against my chest. I sat back down heavily, panting softly from the simple exertion. Taking a long breath to steady my racing heart, I turned on the faucet and let the freezing cold water fill the glass to the brim. I drank it eagerly in one long, desperate gulp. The cool liquid soothed my parched throat, but it did nothing to quench the fierce anger rising in my stomach. I sat there alone in the dark, clutching the empty glass tightly. It had not always been this quiet. My beloved wife Beatrice used to fill these massive rooms with so much warmth and constant laughter. When she passed away suddenly 5 years ago, the heavy silence she left behind was deafening. I slowly learned to live with it, finding peace in the beautiful memories we built together within these solid walls. This $4.2 million estate was our private sanctuary. Then exactly 2 months ago, Derek and Monica showed up unannounced on my porch. They stood there with suitcases in hand and fake tears shining in their eyes. They told me they could not bear the heartbreaking thought of me living all alone in such a giant empty house. They passionately claimed it was their absolute duty to move in and take proper care of me. They promised to cook my meals, manage my appointments, and bring joy back into the lonely house. I was foolish enough to believe their lies. I was lonely enough to ignore the glaring warning signs. I gave them the luxurious master suite. I gave them full access to the stocked pantry. They played the role of devoted children perfectly for the first few weeks. But the very moment I fell down those stairs and became a physical burden, their masks slipped completely. The sweet smiles were quickly replaced with annoyed sighs. The warm meals turned into cold takeout containers left carelessly on the kitchen counter. My mere presence in my own home became an unbearable inconvenience they could barely tolerate. I set the empty water glass down gently on the wet edge of the sink. As I slowly turned my wheelchair around to head back down the hallway, a sudden flash of light caught my eye. The large screen of Monica's tablet had illuminated on the center kitchen island. She carelessly left it sitting there next to a messy pile of unopened mail. I stopped the chair immediately. I always deeply respected their privacy, even when they lived under my roof rent-free. But the rules of engagement had changed today. I wheeled myself silently over to the island and looked down closely at the glowing screen. It was an urgent push notification from a high-end luxury real estate application. The message was displayed clearly in bold black letters right across the locked screen. Congratulations on your accepted offer. Escrow on the new mansion begins next month. Please ensure the deposit of $500,000 is wired by Friday. I stared at the bright screen until the light automatically timed out and faded to pitch black. I sat completely frozen in the dark kitchen. My analytical mind raced, trying desperately to process the absolute impossibility of those words. Derek and Monica were completely broke. Derek's credit cards were maxed out until I personally bailed him out last year. Monica's startup had not turned a single dollar of profit in over 2 years. They claimed poverty just last week when avoiding the grocery bill. So how were they entering escrow on a mansion? Where exactly were they getting a $500,000 cash deposit by Friday? The terrifying answer hit me with the brutal force of a speeding freight train. They were not just waiting for me to die. They were already spending my money. The sun rose over Mercer Island, casting a cold and gray light through the massive kitchen windows. I had not slept a single wink. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair near the large bay window, watching the morning fog roll gently off the dark water of the lake. My mind was sharp and calculating every possible angle of this nightmare. I waited patiently for the house to wake up. Derek walked into the kitchen just after 7 o'clock. He looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes and yawning loudly as he tied the belt of his silk robe. He froze for a fraction of a second when he saw me sitting there in the quiet room, blending in with the early morning shadows. I did not give him a chance to retreat back up the stairs. I asked him to sit down at the table. My voice was calm and steady, betraying absolutely none of the violent rage that was boiling right beneath the surface of my skin. I started with his wife and her unforgivable behavior from the day before. I looked my son dead in the eyes and asked him how he could stand there and listen to Monica speak to me like a stray dog in the street. I reminded him that this was my home, a house paid for with 40 years of my own blood and sweat, and I was his father. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, refusing to meet my gaze. Then, before he could formulate an excuse for her blatant disrespect, I dropped the second heavy weight squarely on his chest. I casually mentioned the glowing screen of the tablet I had seen in the dark kitchen. I quoted the notification word for word. I asked him directly about the $500,000 deposit and the escrow on a brand new luxury mansion. I watched his face, carefully looking for any sign of genuine panic. Derek physically deflated. He slumped his shoulders forward and let out a long, heavy sigh, expertly playing the role of a severely beaten-down man. He leaned his elbows on the marble table and buried his face in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wide and pleading. He told me that Monica was under an immense amount of pressure lately. Her lifestyle application startup, the one she had poured all her energy into, was completely failing. Investors were pulling their funding left and right. She was severely stressed, losing sleep every single night, and sadly lashing out at everyone around her. He apologized profusely for her outburst, claiming she was just overwhelmed and did not mean a single word of what she had said to me. Then came the beautiful, plausible lie about the real estate notification. He let out a sad, self-deprecating laugh that sounded almost entirely genuine. He looked up at me with those earnest eyes and explained that the mansion was not a real purchase at all. He claimed Monica was currently working with an expensive corporate life coach who had suggested she create a daily vision board to stay motivated through her severe business struggles. The notifications, he explained smoothly, were just automated alerts from various luxury real estate websites she browsed to help manifest her future success. They were not actually buying a house, he promised me with his hand over his heart. They barely had enough money in their checking account to cover their own basic living expenses right now. It was a very smooth and practiced lie. If I were truly the senile and weak old man they desperately wanted me to be, I might have patted his hand in sympathy. I might have even offered to write another massive check to save her failing company and ease their burden. But I knew better. You do not get a strict wire transfer deadline for a harmless vision board. You do not get an accepted offer notification from manifesting. But a good hunter never spooks his prey. I nodded slowly, letting my face soften into a convincing expression of fatherly concern. I told him I understood completely how stressful running a business could be. I told him I forgave Monica for her harsh words, graciously blaming it all on the terrible anxiety of a failing startup. Derek smiled warmly, a genuine look of profound relief washing over his entire face. He thanked me over and over again, promising that things would get much better and that they would both try significantly harder to make my recovery comfortable. He stood up from the table, gave my right shoulder a gentle squeeze, and walked out of the kitchen to get dressed for the day. I watched him leave, keeping the mild and forgiving smile plastered firmly on my face until he was completely out of sight. The moment he turned the corner, the smile vanished. I then wheeled myself slowly down the long main hallway toward my private study. It was a room Derek and Monica were strictly forbidden to enter, a firm boundary I had established the very day they moved their belongings into my house. That room held all my sensitive financial documents, my personal journals, and the heavy wall safe that contained the blueprint of my entire estate. As I approached the heavy oak door, my eyes caught something unusual on the pristine hardwood floor. I stopped the wheelchair abruptly. Just a few inches from the polished brass doorknob, there was a strange dark mark on the wood. I leaned forward in my chair, wincing as the movement pulled at my fractured leg. I squinted at the mark to make sure my aging eyes were not playing tricks on me. It was a distinct smudge of gray ash. It looked exactly like the kind of ash that falls from the expensive imported cigars Derek liked to smoke on the back patio when he thought I was asleep. Someone had been standing right outside my forbidden sanctuary. I stared at the smudge of gray ash on the floorboards for a long time. My heart beat a slow and steady rhythm against my ribs. I reached forward and gripped the smooth brass doorknob. It turned easily in my hand. The heavy oak door swung open with a quiet creak, revealing the familiar smell of old paper leather bindings and lemon polish. I rolled my wheelchair slowly over the threshold, shutting the door firmly behind me. I listened closely until the metallic click of the lock echoed in the quiet room. I was completely alone in my private sanctuary. Or so I thought. For 40 years, I worked as a senior logistics engineer. My entire career was built on the meticulous observation of microscopic details. I designed complex supply chain systems where a single misplaced pallet could cost a company millions of dollars. My brain was permanently wired to notice anomalies, to spot the tiny inconsistencies that ordinary people walk right past. The moment I entered the study, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The room looked perfectly normal at a passing glance, but to my trained eyes, it was a glaring crime scene. The heavy Persian rug covering the center of the hardwood floor was shifted exactly half an inch to the left. I knew this because the intricate geometric pattern on the edge of the rug no longer aligned perfectly with the dark wood grain of the floorboards. I wheeled my chair closer to the grand mahogany desk. The heavy leather armchair, which I always left tucked neatly beneath the center drawer, was pulled out just a fraction too far. Someone had been sitting in my chair. Someone had been inside this room. I turned my chair toward the far wall, where a large oil painting of a maritime ship hung silently in the shadows. I reached out and pressed a hidden latch on the side of the ornate wooden frame. The painting swung open smoothly on silent hinges, revealing the cold steel face of my secure wall safe. The digital keypad looked completely untouched. But as I leaned in closer, my eyes caught a faint, oily smudge right over the numbers 4 and 7. It was a fingerprint. Someone had figured out the passcode. My breathing grew shallow as I carefully punched in the sequence. The heavy locking mechanism clicked loudly, and the thick steel door swung wide open. I braced myself for the worst, expecting to see empty shelves. But to my immediate surprise, the thick stacks of emergency cash were still sitting neatly on the bottom shelf, completely untouched. The velvet boxes containing Beatrice and her vintage jewelry were perfectly aligned. The thief had not taken a single physical valuable. They were after something much more lucrative. I reached for the thick manila folder resting on the middle shelf. It was the master file containing my entire estate plan, the irrevocable trust documents, and the detailed deeds to every single property I owned. I pulled the heavy folder onto my lap and opened it slowly. At first glance, the thick stack of legal papers looked perfectly normal, but my heart sank like a heavy stone when I examined the edges of the pages. I am a man of strict habits. Whenever I review my trust documents, I always align the bottom edges of the papers perfectly flush before placing them back into the folder. I tap them against the desk until they form a perfect solid block of paper. But right now, the pages were slightly uneven. Some sheets were protruding just a millimeter higher than the rest. The top corner of the third page was bent slightly backward, creating a tiny crease in the thick parchment paper. They had not stolen the documents because they knew I would immediately report them missing. Instead, they had taken them out, spread them across my desk, and photographed every single page. The ash outside the door, the shifted rug, the fingerprint on the keypad. It all painted a terrifyingly clear picture. Derek had snuck into my study late at night, smoking his expensive cigar to calm his nerves while he systematically documented my entire financial existence. He was looking for loopholes. He was looking for the keys to the kingdom. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The realization that my own son was treating my life savings like a corporate heist made me feel physically ill. I carefully placed the master folder back into the safe and locked the heavy steel door. I needed to know exactly how much damage he had already done. I wheeled my chair quickly over to the large mahogany desk and flipped open my laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the dim study. I opened my secure web browser and navigated straight to my primary banking portal. This was the master account that held the liquid assets, the operational funds for the estate, and the large cash reserves I had spent decades accumulating. I typed my private username with trembling fingers. I entered the complex password I had used securely for the last 3 years. I took a deep breath and firmly pressed the enter key. The screen loaded for an agonizingly slow second. Then a bright red banner flashed across the top of the monitor. The words burned themselves deeply into my vision. Access denied. Password changed. Please contact your branch administrator for immediate assistance. I sat there staring at the flashing red letters, feeling the cold grip of absolute terror tighten around my chest. They had locked me out. My own son had locked me out. I was completely trapped inside my own beautiful home with two people who were systematically erasing my financial existence. I reached for my phone. I needed to call the bank right away. I needed to stop them before it was too late. The game was no longer just about disrespect. It was about pure survival and revenge. I picked up the heavy brass receiver of my desk phone. My fingers were trembling not from age but from the raw anger coursing through my veins. I dialed the private unlisted phone number for the executive wealth management tier at my bank. As a client who maintained a balance of over $10 million for decades, I did not wait in the standard customer service queue. The line rang once before a polite, familiar voice answered the call. It was Sarah, my dedicated account manager for the past 6 years. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to sound entirely calm and steady. I greeted her smoothly and asked her to explain why my primary banking portal was displaying a bright red banner, locking me out of my funds. I expected her to say it was a simple technical error, a glitch in the system that she could fix with a click of a button. Instead, her voice dropped to a low, apologetic whisper. She told me how incredibly sorry she was, but her hands were completely tied by bank policy. She explained that my accounts had been placed under a comprehensive administrative freeze. I asked her who authorized such a ridiculous action. I was the sole owner of the estate. Sarah hesitated for a brief moment before she delivered the devastating blow. She told me that earlier that morning my son Derek had visited the main branch in downtown Seattle. He presented himself as my legally authorized representative. He filed a formal petition to freeze all outgoing transfers and lock the digital portals. When I demanded to know on what legal grounds he could possibly do this, Sarah sounded genuinely heartbroken. She softly explained that Derek had filed a report citing suspected elder fraud and severe cognitive decline. He told the bank management that I was becoming a danger to my own financial security. I sat in the heavy leather chair, the receiver pressed tightly against my ear, stunned into silence. Suspected elder fraud. Severe cognitive decline. The sheer audacity of his lies took my breath away. I thanked Sarah for her honesty and gently placed the phone back onto its cradle. The silence in the study felt entirely different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a padded cell. My mind raced back through the years, searching desperately for how he could possess the legal authority to walk into my bank and freeze my life savings. Then the sickening memory surfaced. 5 years ago, right after Beatrice passed away, I had fallen into a deep depression. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from pneumonia brought on by my grief. During that dark time, I was heavily medicated and exhausted. Derek had come to my bedside acting like the perfect devoted son. He brought me a simple single-page document to sign. It was a limited power of attorney designed just to allow him to pay my property taxes and cover basic utility bills while I was incapacitated. It was a minor temporary authorization meant only for emergencies. I trusted him completely. I never bothered to revoke it after I recovered and returned home. I simply forgot about that single piece of paper. Now, half a decade later, he had pulled that forgotten document out of the shadows. He weaponized my past vulnerability to sever my access to my cash flow. He used the trust I had placed in him during my darkest hour to lock the iron gates of a financial prison around me. The brilliance of his plan was terrifying. By freezing the accounts pretending to protect me from elder fraud, he ensured any complaint I made would look like the paranoia of an old man losing his mind. If I called the police, the bank would back Derek up, confirming he acted out of concern for my mental health. They were methodically building a paper trail to prove I was incompetent. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with sickening precision. The mansion in escrow, the frozen accounts, the careful documentation of my master trust. They were preparing to take over my entire estate, and they needed me entirely helpless to do it. The physical pain in my fractured leg throbbed in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. I needed a strategy. I needed to move carefully, quietly, and with absolute precision. Any sudden outburst of anger would only feed directly into their fabricated narrative of my cognitive decline. I had to play their twisted game, and I had to play it better than them. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to slow its frantic pace. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my trousers and adjusted my posture in the wheelchair. I erased every single trace of panic and anger from my face, replacing it with the dull, passive expression of a tired old man. I practiced a slow, confused blink in the reflection of the dark computer monitor. Just as I perfected the hollow look in my eyes, 3 soft, rhythmic knocks echoed against the heavy oak door of the study. The brass doorknob turned slowly. I quickly closed the laptop lid and rested my hands limply in my lap. The door swung open, and Derek stepped into the room. He was holding a silver tray with a steaming plate of roasted chicken and vegetables. A large glass of ice water sat perfectly balanced on the side. He wore a soft, warm smile that reached his eyes. He looked exactly like a loving, devoted son bringing a comforting meal to his sick father. He walked slowly across the room and gently placed the silver tray down on the corner of my mahogany desk. He patted my shoulder with a terrifyingly gentle touch. "Dad, it is time to eat," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You skipped lunch today. You have been so forgetful lately, and we really need to keep your strength up." I forced a weak, grateful smile, playing the tired father he desperately wanted to see. Derek set the tray down, patted my shoulder, and walked out, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The moment the latch clicked into place, my smile vanished. I wheeled myself closer to the desk and looked down at the steaming plate of roasted chicken and seasonal vegetables. It looked perfectly normal. It smelled perfectly fine. I picked up the heavy silver fork, cut a small piece of the chicken, and placed it into my mouth. I chewed slowly. At first, there was only the familiar taste of rosemary and garlic, but as I swallowed, a harsh metallic bitterness coated the back of my throat. It was a sharp chemical flavor that completely overpowered the seasoning. It was not salt. It was not a culinary mistake. I immediately grabbed a thick white linen napkin from the tray and spat the food out. I grabbed the ice water, rinsed my mouth, and spat into the napkin. I sat there staring at the crumpled white cloth, my chest heaving with silent, terrified breaths. The terrifying reality washed over me in a suffocating wave. The recent periods of intense brain fog. The unnatural heavy fatigue that kept me confined to this wheelchair. The sudden lapses in my memory that Derek was so quick to point out. It was not my age catching up to me. It was not the lingering trauma of my terrible fall down the stairs. My own flesh and blood was slowly poisoning me. They were methodically feeding me chemical sedatives to manufacture a convincing medical history of severe cognitive decline. I was completely trapped inside a beautiful prison at the mercy of 2 people actively destroying my mind. I knew I had to act fast, but I had to be completely invisible. I took the linen napkin, wrapped it tightly around the contaminated food, and shoved it deep into the bottom of my trash can, burying it beneath layers of discarded junk mail. I slowly ate a few dry crackers to settle my upset stomach, carefully waiting for many long hours in the agonizing silence until the entire house finally fell into a deep and unbroken quiet. I listened intently as Derek and Monica retreated to the upstairs master bedroom, their heavy footsteps fading away. When I was absolutely certain they were asleep, I quietly unlocked the study door and wheeled myself out into the dark hallway. I navigated the long, shadowy corridors toward the interior door leading to the attached 4-car garage. The heavy fireproof door was difficult to open from my wheelchair, but pure adrenaline fueled my muscles. I slipped into the cold, cavernous garage, breathing in the familiar scent of motor oil and sawdust. I wheeled past the luxury vehicles and headed straight for the far corner, where my heavy steel logistics toolbox sat gathering dust under a thick canvas tarp. I pulled the tarp back with a swift tug. The toolbox was secured with a heavy combination padlock. I spun the dials with practiced precision, feeling the familiar click as the lock released. I opened the top compartment and reached beneath a tray of rusted wrenches. My fingers brushed against a small plastic object. It was a prepaid, unregistered cellular phone. I bought it years ago during a corporate espionage scare at my company, keeping it charged and hidden for absolute emergencies. I slowly powered the small device on. The bright screen illuminated my tired face in the dark garage. I quickly dialed the direct unlisted cell phone number of Bradley Gibson. Bradley was 55 years old, a completely ruthless and brilliant attorney who operated out of a high-rise office on Wall Street. He had handled my most aggressive corporate takeovers decades ago. He was not just a lawyer, he was an apex predator in a tailored suit. The phone rang 3 times before his deep, gravelly voice answered the line. He did not sound asleep. Men like Bradley never truly slept. I quickly explained the terrifying situation. I told him about the frozen bank accounts, the escrow on the new mansion, and the bitter chemical taste hiding in my dinner. I expected him to sound shocked, but Bradley only let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. He told me he was not surprised in the least. He calmly revealed that his legal team had already intercepted a quiet inquiry made by Derek earlier that week. Derek had secretly reached out to a shady medical evaluator in Seattle, asking for the specific legal requirements to declare a family member completely incompetent. They were building a solid legal case to forcefully place me in a psychiatric facility and take permanent control of my entire estate. My breath hitched in my throat as the sheer cruelty of their plan fully materialized in my mind. I asked Bradley what our next move should be. I told him I wanted to call the police right now and have them both dragged out of my house in handcuffs. Bradley stopped me immediately. He told me that calling the police without concrete, undeniable proof of the poisoning would only make me look like a paranoid, delusional old man playing perfectly into their carefully constructed narrative. "We need hard evidence," Harrison Bradley said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. "We need to catch them confessing to the crime on their own terms." I asked him how we were going to possibly achieve that while I was trapped in this wheelchair, constantly being watched. Bradley paused for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of him typing on a keyboard in the background. "I am sending the package, Harrison," he said finally, his tone completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "It will arrive in 2 days. Just play the old fool until it arrives. Let them think they have completely won this game for now." For the next 48 hours, I played the role of the frail and defeated old man to absolute perfection. It was the most difficult physical and mental performance of my entire life. I shuffled slowly and painfully when moving from my wheelchair to my bed. I feigned severe confusion when Derek spoke to me purposefully, asking him to repeat his simple sentences over and over again. I poured my poisoned meals down the bathroom sink when they were not looking, relying solely on a secret stash of dry crackers hidden deep within my desk drawers to survive the days. Every passing hour felt like a torturous lifetime as I waited anxiously for Bradley to make his move. On Thursday afternoon, the sharp chime of the front doorbell finally echoed through the heavy silence of the house. I wheeled myself cautiously out of the study and into the grand foyer. Through the frosted glass of the double front doors, I could see the distinct silhouette of a private courier waiting patiently on the porch. Before I could even reach out my hand to turn the heavy brass lock, Monica came storming down the sweeping mahogany staircase. She practically shoved my wheelchair aside, her designer heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the imported marble floor. She snatched the small brown cardboard box directly from the bewildered courier, signing the digital pad with a harsh, impatient swipe of her manicured finger. She slammed the heavy front door shut without a word of thanks and stood there staring down at the white shipping label. It was clearly addressed to me, a simple pharmacy delivery from a local branch. I held out my trembling right hand, asking her politely in a weak voice to please pass me my medication. Instead of handing it over, a cruel, mocking smile spread across her heavily contoured face. She dug her sharp painted fingernails under the thick, clear packing tape and brutally ripped the cardboard box open right in front of my eyes. She reached inside the packaging and pulled out 3 large, white plastic prescription bottles. "Old man pills," she sneered loudly, shaking the bottles aggressively so the loose capsules rattled loudly inside the plastic. "Is your fragile mind finally giving out completely on you, Harrison? Do you really need all these expensive supplements just to remember your own name today?" She laughed, a high, piercing sound that grated terribly against my frayed nerves. The bottles were nothing but standard joint vitamins and calcium supplements. A clever and unassuming decoy Bradley had expertly arranged to get the secret package safely past their watchful eyes. I kept my head bowed low, letting my shoulders slump forward in a convincing display of pathetic submission. Monica stepped much closer to my wheelchair, the cruel smile slowly fading into an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, towering over me. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, pointing a sharp finger right at my face. "I have extremely important venture capital investors coming to this house on Sunday morning for a private brunch. These are powerful people who write checks larger than you can even begin to comprehend. They are coming here to see my new lifestyle brand. They are coming to experience the beautiful, wealthy environment I have carefully cultivated. This entire house needs to look absolutely flawless for them. I will not have you rolling around the hallways in that squeaky metal contraption, acting confused and smelling like a depressing hospital ward." She leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper that echoed in the foyer. "You will stay completely hidden upstairs in your bedroom for the entire weekend. You will not come down for breakfast. You will not wheel yourself into the kitchen. You will not make a single sound while my guests are here. If one of my wealthy investors sees a crippled, senile old man wandering around my beautiful estate, it will completely ruin the aesthetic of my brand. Do you understand me? You are a massive embarrassment to my grand vision, Harrison. I need them to believe that Derek and I are the true successful masters of this estate, and your depressing presence ruins that perfect illusion completely. Just stay out of my way and let us secure the massive funding we deserve." I simply nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the intricate patterns of the marble floor. I mumbled a quiet, pathetic apology, perfectly playing the part of the broken elder who knew his place. Monica rolled her eyes in sheer frustration. She carelessly tossed the 3 plastic pill bottles directly into my lap without a care. They bounced off my thighs and scattered across the leather seat of my wheelchair. Then, without a second thought, she turned around and carelessly tossed the supposedly empty cardboard shipping box straight into the tall stainless steel trash can sitting near the kitchen entrance. It landed with a soft thud among the discarded coffee grounds and crumpled paper towels. She spun on her heel and marched away, disappearing quickly back up the grand staircase. I sat entirely alone in the quiet foyer, carefully gathering the scattered plastic bottles into my trembling hands. A slow, cold smile finally broke across my aged face. Monica thought she was so incredibly smart. She thought she had completely dominated the entire situation by ruthlessly humiliating me and thoughtlessly discarding the garbage. But her blind arrogance was her ultimate downfall today. She was so focused on insulting my fake vitamins that she never bothered to inspect the packaging. She did not realize that the cardboard box she had just violently ripped open and tossed aside was significantly heavier than it should have been. She did not know about the cleverly disguised false bottom, and she certainly did not realize that hidden perfectly inside the thick, corrugated lining of that discarded box were 3 military-grade radio-frequency audio listening bugs. I waited in the dark confines of my bedroom until the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed twice. 2 o'clock in the morning. The massive estate was consumed by silence. The wheelchair was too loud, too risky for what I needed to do tonight. I left it parked securely beside my bed. Using my thick wooden cane and the solid weight of my plaster cast, I pulled myself up. The pain was immediate and blinding, a sharp electric shock that traveled from my fractured ankle straight up to my lower back. I bit down hard on my bottom lip to keep from crying out. I shuffled slowly out of my room and made my agonizing way back to the kitchen. The stainless steel trash can stood exactly where Monica had left it. I leaned heavily against the marble counter, reached deep into the garbage, and pulled out the crumpled cardboard box. My fingers easily found the hidden seam along the bottom edge. I peeled back the false cardboard layer. Nestled perfectly inside the thick corrugated lining were 3 tiny black squares. They were no larger than a standard postage stamp, but they were powerful enough to pick up a whisper from across a crowded room. I slipped the 3 audio bugs into the deep pocket of my flannel robe. My first target was the dining room. I moved with agonizing slowness, dragging my heavy cast across the polished hardwood floors. Every single step required a massive amount of calculated effort and physical endurance. I reached the grand dining room, where a massive 12-seat mahogany table dominated the space. This was the exact spot where Derek and Monica sat every single evening, drinking my expensive wine and discussing the future of her failing company. I lowered myself painfully to my good knee, gripping the edge of a heavy dining chair for support. I crawled under the table, the cold wood pressing harshly against my skin. I reached up and pressed the adhesive back of the first bug firmly against the underside of the thick mahogany wood, right near the head of the table where Derek always insisted on sitting. I held it there for 10 seconds, making absolutely sure it was completely secure. 1 down. I pulled myself back up my chest, heaving with silent, ragged breaths. Sweat was pouring down my forehead, stinging my eyes, but I pushed the physical agony deep down into my mind. I had a mission to complete. The second location was significantly more dangerous. I made my way down the long back hallway toward the interior garage door. I slowly turned the handle, praying the deadbolt would not click too loudly. The door opened smoothly. The garage was pitch black and freezing cold. Derek parked his massive luxury SUV right in the center bay. It was a vehicle he bought using the very credit cards I had to pay off just last year. I limped over to the driver's side door. Derek had a terribly arrogant habit of leaving his car unlocked when it was parked securely inside the garage. I pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open with a soft, expensive thud. The interior smelled strongly of his imported cigars and Monica's overwhelming designer perfume. I carefully leaned inside, wedging my upper body awkwardly between the steering wheel and the leather seat. I reached my hand deep underneath the driver's side seat, feeling for a flat, hidden metal bracket among the wiring harnesses. I peeled the backing off the second bug and stuck it securely to the cold metal. If they were planning anything involving doctors, lawyers, or real estate agents, they would absolutely discuss those plans in the false privacy of this car. I quietly closed the heavy car door and leaned against the cold hood, taking a long moment to gather my rapidly fading strength. 2 bugs were planted. I had 1 left. I limped back inside the house, securing the garage door firmly behind me. My final target was the living room. I slowly made my way toward the expensive Italian leather sofa where Monica spent almost all of her time swiping on her tablet and barking orders at her non-existent employees. This was the exact spot where she had humiliated me just a few days ago, telling me to crawl on the floor like a dog. Now I was willingly crawling on the floor, but I was setting a lethal trap. I lowered myself down beside the heavy sofa, feeling the soft leather against my trembling hands. I reached deep into the narrow crevice between the thick bottom cushions and the solid wooden frame of the couch. I pushed my fingers as far back as they could possibly go, hiding the third bug in a place where no cleaning lady or lost remote control search would ever uncover it. I pressed it firmly against the interior fabric. The trap was finally fully set. The entire house was completely wired. The journey back upstairs to my bedroom took an agonizing 20 minutes. My fractured leg was throbbing with a brutal, relentless rhythm. By the time I finally collapsed onto the edge of my mattress, my entire body was trembling from absolute exhaustion. But I could not sleep. I reached into the top drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the small black wireless receiver Bradley had included in the hidden shipment. I placed the discreet earpiece into my right ear and flipped the tiny power switch. A low, soft hiss of static filled my ear for a brief second before the frequency locked in. The static cleared completely. I sat perfectly still in the dark bedroom. Suddenly, the distinct sound of a hushed, frantic conversation echoed directly into my ear. It was coming from the living room sofa downstairs. I held my breath, listening intently to the crystal-clear audio. What I heard them planning in the dark made the blood in my veins run completely cold. The audio feed from the hidden bug inside the living room sofa was terrifyingly crisp. I sat completely frozen on the edge of my mattress, pressing the small plastic earpiece deeper into my ear. I could hear the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of wine being poured. It was a mundane domestic noise that completely contrasted with the sheer evil of the conversation that followed. Monica was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. Her heavy footsteps echoed directly into my mind. I could hear the sharp sigh she let out before she finally spoke. Her voice was stripped of the fake sugary sweetness she used whenever she knew I was in the room. In the absolute privacy of the dark house, her true nature was on full display. It was cold, calculated, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "Did you put the crushed sedatives in his soup tonight?" Monica asked abruptly. Her words pierced through the quiet darkness of my bedroom like a physical weapon. I heard Derek shift heavily on the expensive leather cushions. He let out a low, frustrated groan before answering. "Yes, I put them in the soup just like we agreed," he replied, his voice laced with a mixture of annoyance and exhaustion. "I ground up 3 pills and mixed them into the broth before I brought the tray into the study. He did not eat much of it, but he definitely ingested enough to keep the chemicals active in his bloodstream. We just have to keep this up for a few more days." Monica stopped pacing. The heavy silence stretched out for a tense moment. "If he does not start acting like a severe dementia patient by tomorrow afternoon, the concierge doctor is not going to sign the final medical evaluation." She snapped, her tone rising in pure frustration. "You know exactly how strict these independent medical reviews can be. We cannot just claim he is losing his mind. We need to physically prove he is completely incapable of managing his own estate. If the doctor notices a single moment of absolute mental clarity, he will refuse to sign the power of attorney transfer." I closed my eyes tightly, feeling a cold bead of sweat slowly roll down my temple. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal hit me so hard it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of my bedroom. The heavy, suffocating brain fog that had been plaguing me for the past month. The terrifying moments when I could not remember simple conversations from the day before. The extreme, unnatural fatigue that made my limbs feel like they were made of solid lead. I had honestly believed my aging body was simply failing me after the severe trauma of falling down the stairs. I had spent countless nights lying awake in this very bed, silently terrified that my mind was slowly deteriorating, that I was losing the sharp intellect I had relied on for my entire life. But it was not natural decline. It was not the cruel hand of old age. It was a meticulously planned, systematic poisoning. My own flesh and blood, the son I had nurtured and protected for 45 years, was actively destroying my brain chemistry to manufacture a fake medical history. He was methodically erasing my sanity just to steal my money. The psychological torture of believing you are losing your mind is indescribable. To know that the people causing that terror are the ones sleeping under your roof, eating the food you bought, and smiling to your face is a level of pure evil I could barely comprehend. I clutched the wooden handle of my cane with trembling fingers, struggling to contain the violent surge of absolute rage that threatened to consume me. I wanted to march down those stairs, turn on every single light in the house, and confront them right then and there. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. But I remembered the cold, rational advice from Bradley. They were expecting an angry, paranoid old man. They were actively trying to provoke an irrational outburst to prove to the authorities that I was completely unstable. I had to remain a silent ghost in my own home. I had to endure this agonizing performance until the trap was perfectly primed to snap shut around their necks. Every fiber of my being wanted immediate justice, but true vengeance requires absolute patience. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart back into a steady rhythm. I tuned my attention back to the earpiece. Derek was pouring himself another glass of wine. The liquid splashed loudly in the crystal glass. "Stop worrying so much, Monica," Derek said, his voice dripping with an arrogant confidence that made me violently ill. "I have carefully researched the exact dosage. I know exactly what I am doing here. By the time the concierge doctor arrives on Friday morning, he will be a complete vegetable. He will barely be able to remember his own name, let alone understand complex legal documents. Once the doctor signs the official evaluation confirming his severe cognitive decline, the entire estate legally transfers into my complete control by Friday afternoon. The bank will have absolutely no choice but to lift the account freeze and grant me total executive authority over his vast financial assets." Monica let out a soft, cruel laugh that sent a terrible shiver down my spine. "And then we can finally use the deed to this massive house as collateral for the $5 million bridge loan to save my company," she whispered greedily. "The investors will see the pristine estate on Sunday, the bank will clear the loan, and we will be completely untouchable." The clock was ticking down to Friday morning, but they had absolutely no idea that I was already 5 steps ahead of their entire pathetic criminal operation. Friday morning arrived with a heavy overcast sky that perfectly matched the grim theatrical performance I was about to deliver. I sat in my wheelchair near the window of my bedroom, staring blankly out at the manicured lawn. I had carefully positioned myself to look small, frail, and entirely defeated. My posture was slumped, my chin resting weakly against my chest. My pajamas were slightly wrinkled, and I had undone the top 2 buttons to give the distinct impression of a man who could no longer manage his own basic personal care. I heard the heavy front door open downstairs, followed by the muffled sound of low professional voices echoing in the foyer. The decisive moment had finally arrived. Footsteps approached my bedroom door. The brass handle turned slowly, and Derek stepped into the room, followed closely by a tall, sharply dressed man carrying a sleek leather medical bag. The stranger did not look like a traditional family physician. He had the slick, polished demeanor of a man who dealt exclusively with wealthy clients, who needed discreet favors rather than a doctor who actually cared about healing the sick. I knew the moment I laid eyes on his arrogant, calculating face that he was already bought and paid for. This evaluation was nothing more than a highly expensive, illegal formality. Derek walked over to my wheelchair, crouching down to my eye level. He put on a deeply convincing mask of profound sorrow, his brow furrowed with fake concern. "Dad," he said softly, using a gentle, patronizing tone, usually reserved for young children. "This is Dr. Evans. He is here to check on you today and make sure you are feeling all right. Do you understand who he is, Dad?" I slowly lifted my head, making sure my eyes appeared completely vacant and unfocused. I let my mouth hang open slightly, controlling my breathing to make it sound shallow and labored. I looked right through Derek, staring blankly at the wall behind him. I did not say a single word. I just offered a slow, confusing blink. Dr. Evans stepped forward, pulling a silver pen and a thick notepad from his breast pocket. He did not bother to greet me warmly or establish any genuine rapport. He simply looked down at me with cold, clinical detachment. "Good morning, Harrison," the doctor said, loudly, speaking slowly, as if I were entirely deaf. "Can you tell me what day of the week it is today? Can you tell me what year we are currently in?" This was my moment. The culmination of 48 hours of sheer psychological endurance. I let my eyes wander around the room frantically, feigning a sudden burst of panicked confusion. I raised my trembling hands, pawing weakly at the air. I slurred my words heavily, letting a thick string of saliva pool in the corner of my mouth. "Beatrice," I mumbled, calling out for my late wife with a desperate, heartbroken whine. "Beatrice, why is it so cold in here? Tell the men at the warehouse to shut the loading bay doors. They are letting the winter draft inside." Dr. Evans furiously scribbled notes onto his pad, nodding knowingly at Derek. "It has been like this all week," Dr. Derek whispered, his voice trembling perfectly. "He thinks he is still running the logistics company. He thinks my mother is still alive. It is absolutely heartbreaking to watch him deteriorate so rapidly." I flinched aggressively, swatting at his hand with uncoordinated, clumsy movements. "Who are you?" I shouted, allowing genuine anger to bleed into the performance but disguising it as the irrational fear of a broken mind. "Get away from me! Where is Thomas? Thomas, help me!" I reached out and grabbed Derek firmly by his shirt collar, pulling him down toward me. "Thomas, tell this strange man to get out of my office," I demanded, deliberately calling my son by the name of his older cousin. "You are a terrible assistant, Thomas. I am firing you immediately." Derek gently pried my trembling hands off his collar, stepping back with a perfectly timed look of complete devastation. "He does not even recognize his own son anymore," Derek whispered to the doctor, a single fake tear welling up in his eye. Dr. Evans clicked his silver pen shut and slid it back into his pocket. He looked at Derek with a grim, practiced expression of professional sympathy. "I have seen absolutely everything I need to see," Derek, the doctor said softly. "The cognitive decline is severe and undeniably advanced. He is completely detached from reality and suffering from acute dementia. I will sign the medical evaluation forms right now in the kitchen. You have my full professional authorization to assume total power of attorney over his estate." Derek nodded solemnly, playing the role of the reluctant but responsible son to the very bitter end. "Thank you, Doctor," Derek replied softly. "I just want to keep him safe. Let us go downstairs to handle the paperwork so he can rest." They turned their backs to me and walked out of the bedroom, quietly pulling the heavy oak door shut behind them. I heard the metallic click of the latch settling perfectly into place. I waited for 10 long, agonizing seconds, listening closely, until the sound of their footsteps completely faded down the hallway staircase. The moment the house fell silent, the entire pathetic facade dropped. I instantly sat up perfectly straight in my wheelchair. My breathing slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. The vacant, confused look vanished from my eyes, replaced immediately by the sharp, terrifying clarity of a predator who had just successfully cornered its prey. I wiped my mouth clean with the back of my hand. I reached smoothly under the soft cushion of my wheelchair and pulled out the cheap black burner phone. I typed a single text message to Bradley Gibson. They bought it. Proceed to phase 2. I pressed send and calmly placed the phone away. Slipping it beneath my wheelchair cushion just as heavy footsteps returned up the stairs. I quickly reassumed my pathetic posture, slouching my shoulders and letting my head loll. The door creaked open, and Derek walked back into the bedroom. The slick concierge doctor was gone. Derek walked toward my mahogany desk, his hands clutching a single sheet of white paper attached to a heavy wooden clipboard. He picked up a solid brass fountain pen from the holder, a vintage item Beatrice had gifted me. He walked over to my wheelchair, with a bright, encouraging smile plastered across his deceitful face, the kind of smile you give a toddler about to take medicine. "Dad," he said softly, holding the clipboard out. "I know you are feeling tired, but I just got off the phone with your insurance provider. We need to update your standard Medicare renewal forms immediately. The deadline is this afternoon, and if we do not get your signature right now, they will cancel your supplemental health coverage. You do not want to lose your medical benefits, do you?" He pressed the brass pen into my right hand and guided the heavy clipboard onto my lap. I could feel the desperate, greedy tension radiating from his entire body. He hovered over me like a starving vulture waiting for an animal to take its final breath. He tapped his finger right on the bottom line where a small red arrow pointed to the signature box. "Just sign right here, Dad," he coaxed gently. "Just your standard signature, and I will take care of the details." I slowly lifted my trembling hand, making sure the vintage fountain pen wobbled unsteadily between my fingers. I let out a confused, rattling sigh. "I need my reading glasses," I mumbled, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "The letters are all blurry, Thomas. I cannot see the lines." Derek let out a sharp, impatient breath, clearly annoyed by the delay. He snatched my wire-rimmed glasses from the bedside table and shoved them aggressively onto my face. There he snapped, his true frustration leaking through the facade. "Now please, just sign the paper." I lowered my head and stared intently at the document. It was formatted beautifully to look exactly like a standard government healthcare form. There was a fake insurance logo at the top left corner and a long list of confusing medical billing codes. But my eyes bypassed the bold headings. 40 years of analyzing complex corporate contracts had trained me to always read the small, densely packed paragraphs buried in the middle of the page, the tiny font that most people simply ignore. As my eyes scanned the densely packed text, the true nature of the document revealed itself in horrifying detail. It was not a Medicare renewal form. It was an irrevocable, comprehensive, durable power of attorney, and it was absolutely merciless in its cruel intent. The carefully crafted legal jargon explicitly granted Derek the absolute right to liquidate all of my real estate holdings, including this very house, without requiring any further authorization from me. It gave him absolute and total control over my investment portfolios and my private bank accounts. But the most terrifying paragraph was buried near the very bottom. It granted him the full legal authority to unilaterally commit me to a long-term residential psychiatric facility. If my pen touched that piece of paper, I would instantly cease to be a free man. I would be legally erased, stripped of my wealth, my home and my personal freedom, all with a single stroke of ink. My blood boiled fiercely with an intense, unforgiving, and deeply fiery rage. He was going to maliciously sell my beautiful home to save his wife and her pathetic business, and he was going to lock me away in a padded room so I could never fight back. I knew I could not simply refuse to sign. If I suddenly demonstrated the sharp mental capacity to read and reject a complex legal document, he would immediately know I was faking my cognitive decline. He would realize the doctor visit was a sham, and he would forcefully find another way to take me down. I had to destroy the document while maintaining the illusion of complete incompetence. I looked past the clipboard, my eyes landing on the small side table next to my wheelchair. Resting precariously near the edge of the polished wood was an open bottle of dark black calligraphy ink I had been using earlier in the week. I took a deep, shaky breath and leaned forward. I raised my right hand, letting it shake violently, as if I were suffering from a severe neurological tremor. The brass pen clattered loudly against the metal clip of the wooden board. "I am trying," I whimpered pitifully, letting my hand swing wildly in the air. "I cannot keep my arm steady. It is shaking too much." Derek leaned in close, his face turning red with mounting anger. "Just grip the pen tightly and sign your name," he growled through clenched teeth. I forcefully swung my arm in a wide, erratic arc, pretending to lose complete control of my exhausted muscles. The heavy brass pen flew from my fingers, striking the side of the glass ink bottle with perfect, calculated precision. The bottle tipped over immediately. A thick, dark wave of permanent black ink spilled directly across the wooden table, splashing violently over the edge and landing squarely onto the clipboard resting on my lap. The thick black liquid instantly saturated the crisp white paper, completely obliterating the signature line and ruining the entire legal document beyond any possible repair. Derek stared at the massive black stain in absolute stunned horror. Then his face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. He threw his hands into the air and let out a loud, agonizing scream of total frustration that echoed violently through the entire house. Derek stormed out of my bedroom, his face flushed with a terrifying shade of crimson. He slammed the heavy oak door shut with incredible force. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, listening to his heavy footsteps stomping down the staircase. I wiped my ink-stained fingers on a tissue, my heart pounding a steady rhythm. I had successfully bought myself a little more time, but I knew the ruined document would only make them desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I reached under my cushion and pulled out the wireless receiver. I placed the earpiece into my ear and cycled through the frequencies. The first two channels were completely silent. But when I switched to the third frequency, the bug hidden underneath the driver's seat of Derek's luxury SUV, the audio feed crackled to life. I heard the hum of the garage door opening, followed immediately by the sound of two car doors slamming shut. They had retreated to the vehicle to argue. It was their safe haven, the only place where their dark secrets were secure. Monica was screaming before Derek could even start the engine. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with an uncontrollable fury. "What do you mean he ruined the copy?" she shrieked, the sound distorting slightly through the microphone. "The concierge doctor already left. We cannot call him back for another set of forms. The investors are arriving for brunch on Sunday morning. If we do not have the legal power of attorney finalized by the time they walk through the door, they will ask for proof of collateral. They will want to see the deed." Derek let out a heavy groan, slapping his hands aggressively against the leather steering wheel. "I am telling you, Monica, it was a complete disaster." He shot back, his voice thick with anger. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He knocked the entire bottle of black calligraphy ink right over the signature line. "The paper is soaked through. It is entirely illegible. We have to print a brand new copy and force him to try again tonight. I will physically wrap his fingers around the pen." I listened to my son calmly discuss physically assaulting me to forge a legal document. But what came next shattered any remaining shred of humanity I associated with them. Monica let out a furious growl. "I cannot wait until tonight," she screamed, her voice cracking under the pressure of her failing lies. "I am sick and tired of waiting for this pathetic old man to disappear. Do you have any idea how much I have sacrificed to keep this timeline moving? I did not want to wait for the poison to slowly rot his brain. That is why I took matters into my own hands last month." A suffocating silence filled the interior of the SUV. Derek's breathing grew suddenly shallow. "What are you talking about, Monica?" he asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "I did not just let him fall down those stairs by accident," she hissed venomously, the sheer malice in her words making my blood run cold. I rubbed a thick layer of industrial floor wax all over the top 3 wooden steps while he was asleep. I polished the wood until it was slick as pure ice. I did it so he would slip. I did it so he would fall backward and break his miserable neck, and the stubborn old bastard only managed to break his leg. I stopped breathing. The terrible memory of that morning flashed vividly through my mind. I remembered stepping onto the top landing, the terrifying lack of friction beneath my feet, the violent sensation of falling backward into empty space, and the agonizing crunch of my bones hitting the wooden edges of the stairs. I had blamed my own clumsiness. I had felt embarrassed and frail. But it was not an accident. My daughter-in-law had deliberately set a lethal trap in my home to murder me. I waited for Derek to react. I waited for the son I had raised to express horror, to realize the monstrous nature of the woman he married. I waited for him to call the police. But the response that echoed through my earpiece was the final devastating nail in his coffin. "Keep your voice down," Derek hissed back quickly, showing absolutely no shock or outrage at the confession of attempted murder. "Are you completely insane? If anyone hears you say that we are both going to prison for the rest of our lives, you should have told me you were going to do that. I could have made sure the landing was clear. Now we have to clean up this giant mess. Just go back upstairs and print a new document. I will grind up a double dose of sedatives for his dinner. We will make him sign it tonight." The audio feed continued to crackle with their frantic plotting, but I stopped listening. I pulled the earpiece from my ear and placed the receiver onto my desk. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer trembling. The deep sorrow that had weighed heavily on my chest completely evaporated. The heartbreaking grief of losing a son was gone. In its place, an icy clarity washed over my being. They were not just greedy children making mistakes. They were calculating predators who actively tried to end my life for a piece of real estate. And my son was a willing accomplice. The fragile old man they thought they were torturing had officially died on those waxed stairs. The man sitting in the wheelchair now was the ruthless architect of an empire, and I was about to meticulously dismantle their miserable lives. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to execute the trap. Let them have their Sunday brunch. Let them invite their wealthy investors into my home. I was going to give them a grand finale they would remember forever. The rest of Friday passed in a heavy, suffocating silence. Derek did not return to my bedroom to force another signature. He likely assumed the double dose of sedatives he planned for my dinner would make me far more compliant by the weekend. When the poisoned meal inevitably arrived on a silver tray that evening, I dumped the entire contents into a plastic bag I had hidden beneath my mattress. I sat alone, in the dim light of my bedside lamp, listening to the faint sounds of the television echoing from the downstairs living room. I reached into the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden nightstand and pulled out a thick, leather-bound photo album. Its edges were worn soft from decades of use. I laid it gently across my lap and slowly turned the heavy pages. The photographs staring back at me felt like relics from a completely different lifetime. There was Derek at 7 years old, grinning widely, missing his 2 front teeth, proudly holding up a small plastic trophy from his summer baseball league. I remembered how his mother and I had cheered so loudly from the wooden bleachers. I turned the page. There was Derek at 18, standing tall in his high school graduation gown, wrapping his arms tightly around Beatrice. The sheer pride shining in her eyes was beautiful. She had always believed he would grow up to be a strong, honorable man. I had believed it too. We gave him every single advantage, every possible opportunity to succeed in this difficult world. We shielded him from the harsh realities of poverty and struggle that I had endured to build my logistics empire. But in our desperate attempt to give him a perfect life, we had inadvertently raised a hollow, greedy shell of a human being. A single tear slid down my wrinkled cheek, splashing quietly onto the protective plastic of the photo album. It was the very last tear I would ever shed for my son. I sat there in the quiet bedroom and allowed myself to fully mourn the boy I thought I had raised. I grieved for the potential he had squandered and the absolute betrayal he had chosen. But as I closed the heavy leather cover of the album, the grieving process abruptly ended. I mentally dug a deep grave in the dark corners of my mind. I took the smiling boy from those photographs, and I buried him there, sealing the memory shut forever. The 45-year-old man currently living under my roof was no longer my flesh and blood. He was a dangerous, calculating parasite who had tried to take my life. And I treat parasites with absolute, uncompromising eradication. I reached under my wheelchair cushion and pulled out the cheap black burner phone. My hands were perfectly steady now. The emotional storm had completely passed, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened resolve. I dialed the secure number for Bradley Gibson. He answered on the very first ring, his deep voice sharp and alert despite the late hour. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him everything. I recounted the horrifying audio recording from the luxury vehicle. I told him about the industrial floor wax, the deliberate attempt to break my neck on the stairs, and their desperate plan to force my signature before their fancy Sunday brunch. The line went completely silent for a long moment. Even a ruthless Wall Street shark like Bradley was momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadulterated evil of their actions. Then his voice returned lower and significantly more dangerous than before. He asked me what my exact orders were. I looked out the dark window toward the calm waters of the lake. No more waiting, I told him, my voice echoing with a quiet, lethal authority. They are hosting a massive brunch for their venture capital investors this Sunday morning. It starts exactly at 10 o'clock. They are using my beautiful estate to project wealth they do not have to secure a $5 million loan. We strike then. We strike when they are standing at the absolute height of their arrogance. Do not just bring the cease and desist orders, Bradley. Bring the police. Bring the criminal fraud detectives. Bring everyone. I want them to lose everything in front of the very people they are desperately trying to impress. Bradley let out a dark, satisfied chuckle that vibrated through the small speaker of the phone. Consider it done, Harrison, he replied smoothly. I will personally coordinate with the Seattle Police Department tomorrow morning. We will have the audio recordings fully transcribed and the arrest warrants completely finalized. Get some rest. Sunday is going to be a beautifully destructive day. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into its hiding place. The next day, Saturday, was a whirlwind of frantic, arrogant activity. I remained hidden in my bedroom, entirely out of sight, just as Monica had aggressively demanded. But my window provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the sprawling backyard. By late Saturday afternoon, a small army of expensive caterers and event planners had descended upon my property. They were setting up large white canvas tents, arranging elegant floral centerpieces on long dining tables, and polishing towering champagne fountains on my imported stone patio. Monica was marching right through the center of it all, acting exactly like the grand lady of the manor. I could hear her sharp, shrill voice echoing all the way up to my second-story window as she aggressively shouted orders at the hired staff. She was rudely criticizing the placement of the expensive silverware, demanding the floral arrangements be redone, and parading around my property with an air of absolute unearned superiority. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully conquered the crippled old man upstairs, securing her luxurious future over my dead body. She stood proudly on the patio, completely oblivious to the massive, inescapable trap that was about to violently snap shut around her neck. Sunday morning broke with a clear, crisp blue sky, offering the absolute perfect backdrop for the grand theater Monica had orchestrated. The harsh Seattle fog had completely burned off, allowing the bright sunlight to reflect beautifully off the calm surface of Lake Washington. I remained stationed at my bedroom window, watching the final preparations unfold below. The quiet estate had been transformed into a lavish country club. White linen tablecloths fluttered gently in the morning breeze. Crystal champagne flutes were stacked meticulously on silver trays, catching the light like diamonds. A classical string quartet was setting up their instruments near the edge of the manicured rose garden, tuning their violins to provide a sophisticated soundtrack for the massive financial fraud about to take place. Promptly at 10 o'clock, the heavy iron gates at the front of the property swung open, and the luxury vehicles began to roll slowly up the long, circular driveway. I watched closely as the valet drivers rushed to open the doors of imported sedans and sleek sports cars. These were not ordinary guests. These were high-profile venture capitalists, private equity managers, and elite angel investors from the downtown financial district. They were men and women who dealt exclusively in millions individuals who demanded absolute perfection and concrete collateral before they ever opened their checkbooks. They stepped onto the pristine cobblestones, wearing sharp designer suits and expensive silk dresses, completely unaware that they were walking directly into an active crime scene. Monica glided out onto the back patio to greet them, looking every inch the wealthy heiress she desperately pretended to be. She wore a stunning, perfectly tailored white dress that undoubtedly cost more than her failing company had earned in an entire year. Her hair was styled immaculately, and she wore a heavy diamond necklace that sparkled aggressively in the sunlight. She laughed loudly, placing her hands gently on the arms of the wealthy investors, guiding them toward the open bar with a practiced, predatory charm. Derek was right by her side, playing the role of the devoted and successful husband to absolute perfection. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, his hair slicked back smoothly. He handed out expensive cigars and poured vintage champagne, laughing at jokes he did not find funny, desperately securing the illusion of their massive financial stability. I stepped away from the window and walked slowly toward the full-length mirror resting in the corner of my bedroom. The frail, broken old man in the wrinkled pajamas was completely gone. I had spent the last hour dressing with absolute meticulous care. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that I had purchased in London 10 years ago. It still fit my shoulders perfectly. I tied a crisp, dark red silk tie around my neck. I polished my leather dress shoes until they gleamed. I did not need the wheelchair. I strapped a heavy medical brace tightly around my fractured leg and picked up my solid oak walking cane. I looked at my reflection, seeing the ruthless, calculated logistics engineer who had built an empire from the ground up. I was ready. I slowly made my agonizing way out of the bedroom and began my descent down the grand mahogany staircase. Every single step sent a jolt of sharp pain through my injured leg, but I welcomed the agony. It fueled my absolute resolve. I navigated the long downstairs hallway and positioned myself silently just behind the heavy oak back doors that led directly out to the grand stone patio. The doors were cracked open just an inch, allowing me to hear every single word of the presentation unfolding outside. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low murmur of wealthy chatter faded away as Monica clinked a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. She stood at the center of the patio, smiling warmly at the captive audience of investors. "Thank you all so much for coming to our beautiful home this morning." Monica began, her voice projecting clearly across the manicured lawn. "As you look around this magnificent $4.2 million estate, I want you to see more than just beautiful architecture and imported stone. I want you to see the solid, unshakable foundation of our family legacy. This property represents the exact same standard of uncompromising excellence and financial security that I am bringing to my new lifestyle brand." She paused dramatically, letting the greedy investors take in the sweeping views of the lake and the expensive landscaping. "We are currently seeking a $5 million bridge loan to expand our operations nationally," she continued smoothly. "And we are fully prepared to leverage the total equity of this pristine estate as absolute concrete collateral for your generous investments. You are not just investing in a company today. You are partnering with an established family enterprise." One of the older investors, a stern-looking man holding a leather portfolio, raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me, Monica," he said, his voice carrying a note of professional curiosity. "The property records indicate this estate is legally owned by your father-in-law, Harrison Blake. Will he be joining us this morning to sign the necessary collateral agreements?" Monica let out a soft, perfectly practiced sigh of profound sadness. She lowered her eyes masterfully, playing the tragic heroine. Derek stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sadly, my father will not be joining us," Derek said, his voice dropping to a somber, respectful whisper. "My father is resting upstairs. He is unfortunately in the very late stages of severe dementia. His cognitive decline has been incredibly rapid and entirely heartbreaking for our family. He no longer recognizes us or understands his surroundings. Because of his tragic condition, Monica and I are now legally managing his entire estate and all of his financial affairs to ensure his legacy is properly protected." I pushed the heavy oak back doors wide open. Instantly, all the cheerful investor chatter stopped. The heavy oak doors hit the exterior stone walls with a resounding thud that echoed across the manicured lawn. I stepped out onto the sunlit patio. I was not sitting in a wheelchair. I was not slouched over, and my head was not lolling to the side in a state of pathetic confusion. I stood tall and proud, my back perfectly straight, my shoulders squared beneath the immaculate fabric of my charcoal gray suit. I leaned slightly on my solid oak walking cane, but it was a posture of quiet authority, not of broken frailty. The crisp morning air brushed gently against my weathered face as I took a moment to survey the silent crowd of wealthy venture capitalists. The striking contrast between the tragic senile old man Derek had just so eloquently described and the sharp, imposing figure standing before them could not have been more absolute. My eyes swept across the sea of designer suits and expensive dresses. My gaze was completely clear, sharp, and terrifyingly focused. I was not a victim wandering out of his bedroom. I was the master of the house returning to reclaim his territory. I did not walk out onto that patio alone. Flanking my right side was Bradley Gibson. He wore a razor-sharp black suit carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the destruction of my son and his wife. Bradley looked out at the assembled crowd with the cold, predatory smirk of a Wall Street shark who had just cornered a school of wounded fish. On my left side stood two uniformed officers from the Seattle Police Department. Their brass badges caught the bright morning sunlight, and their hands rested cautiously near their heavy utility belts. Walking slightly ahead of them was a seasoned economic fraud detective, wearing a tan trench coat, his sharp eyes scanning the very well-dressed crowd with intense professional suspicion. The sudden appearance of law enforcement at a high society brunch sent an immediate icy shockwave through the gathered crowd. The polite, eager smiles instantly vanished from the pampered faces of the investors. The cheerful ambiance evaporated into thin air. These were smart, calculating financial experts. They knew immediately that the presence of police and a ruthless corporate attorney meant that something was deeply and terribly wrong. The string quartet remained completely frozen, their bows hovering silently over the strings of their violins. The only sound left in the massive backyard was the rustling of the wind through the tall oak trees and the steady, rhythmic tapping of my wooden cane against the imported stone patio. I turned my piercing gaze directly toward the center of the patio, where my son and his wife stood completely and totally paralyzed. Monica was frozen mid-breath. The warm, charismatic smile she had been wearing just seconds ago had melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Her perfectly manicured fingers suddenly went completely limp. The beautiful crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp. It fell through the air in agonizing slow motion and struck the hard stone floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 tiny glittering pieces, the sharp sound echoing violently in the absolute suffocating silence of the morning. The expensive vintage champagne splashed across the hem of her pristine white designer dress, staining the fabric, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization that her entire carefully constructed dark reality was crashing down around her. Beside her, Derek looked like he had just seen a ghost. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of gray as his breathing grew incredibly shallow. His jaw trembled slightly. He took a small, involuntary step backward instinctively, trying to hide himself from the sheer magnitude of my wrath. The confident, devoted son, who had just tearfully lied to a crowd of millionaires, was gone. In his place stood a terrified, cowardly boy who finally realized he had severely underestimated his father. I did not say a single word to them. I did not need to shout or hurl angry accusations. My presence alone was a devastating blow. I gripped the smooth wooden handle of my cane and began to walk slowly toward the center of the patio. I moved with deliberate, measured steps, ignoring the sharp, relentless throbbing radiating deep within my fractured leg. Every time the heavy rubber tip of my cane struck the stone, the sound rang out like a judge banging his gavel in a silent courtroom. The wealthy investors instinctively parted ways, stepping back quickly to carve out a wide, respectful path for me and my formidable legal and law enforcement entourage. They watched me with a mixture of profound awe and deep apprehension. They had come here to leverage my wealth, and now they were watching the true source of that wealth march right through their ranks. Bradley Gibson stayed close to my side, his dark eyes locked firmly on Monica and Derek. The police officers spread out slightly, securing the perimeter of the patio, making it completely clear that nobody was leaving this property until I was finished. I walked right past the shattered crystal glass and the puddle of spilled champagne. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Monica and Derek. The air between us was thick with suffocating tension. I looked deeply into my son's terrified eyes, letting him see the vast, empty void where my unconditional fatherly love for him used to reside. Then I turned my back to them entirely. I reached out with a steady, unwavering hand and grabbed the silver stand of the microphone they had set up for their fraudulent business pitch. I adjusted the height of the tall microphone stand, the harsh metallic scraping sound echoing loudly through the massive speakers. I tapped the microphone twice. The dull thumps reverberated clearly across the silent lawn. I was fully ready to speak. I stood before the microphone listening to the dull thumps echo across the lawn. The investors stared back at me in complete silence. They were waiting for the confused old man to mumble incoherently and prove Monica right. They were waiting for a spectacle. Instead, I smiled a cold smile and took one deliberate step back from the silver microphone stand. I gestured smoothly with my hand toward Bradley Gibson. My attorney stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the stone patio. He set his thick briefcase down on a nearby cocktail table. He popped the brass latches open with 2 loud clicks. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy paper, complete with county seals. He approached the microphone, adjusting it slightly, to match his height. He looked out over the crowd of venture capitalists, with the supreme confidence of a man holding all the winning cards. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Bradley began, his deep voice booming through the outdoor speakers. "My name is Bradley Gibson. I am the senior legal counsel and primary estate executor for Mr. Harrison Blake. I apologize for interrupting your Sunday brunch, but there is a severe matter of corporate fraud requiring your immediate attention. I understand many of you are here today under the impression you are negotiating a $5 million bridge loan. I also understand the proposed collateral for this massive investment is the estate you are standing on right now." Bradley paused, letting his dark eyes sweep over the crowd before locking directly onto Monica. He held up the thick stack of papers. "I am here to formally advise you that Monica and Derek Blake do not own this property. They do not hold the deed. They do not have power of attorney, and they possess zero collateral to offer you today." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of investors. People began to whisper frantically, their eyes darting between Bradley, Monica, and the police officers. Furthermore, Bradley continued, his voice rising over the sudden murmur of the crowd. "Even if Mr. Blake had tragically lost his mental faculties, which he clearly has not, his son would still not inherit a single brick of this estate. 3 years ago, with my legal assistance, Harrison secretly transferred the deed of this entire $4.2 million property into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Upon his passing, or in the event of severe medical incapacitation, this house and all of its surrounding land belongs entirely to a designated veterans charity organization. The documents Derek photographed in his father's private study were nothing more than carefully planted, outdated decoys. They own absolutely nothing. They are completely and utterly broke." The patio erupted into absolute chaos. Several investors immediately set down their champagne glasses and began walking briskly toward the front gates, eager to distance themselves from a massive, highly illegal fraud scheme. Monica snapped out of her terrified paralysis. Her face twisted into an ugly, desperate mask of pure panic. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at Bradley. "That is a complete lie!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice completely shattering her carefully cultivated illusion of high society elegance. "He is making it all up. Look at him. Look at that old man. He is entirely senile. He does not even know where he is right now. He had a severe fall down the stairs last month, and his brain is rotting. The doctor was just here on Friday and confirmed he has acute dementia. You cannot listen to this fake lawyer. We have the medical evaluations. We have the legal right to secure this loan." Derek suddenly stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to physically intimidate us. He marched aggressively toward Bradley, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His face was bright red with sheer embarrassment and uncontrolled anger. You need to get off my property right now, Gibson. Derek shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the intense pressure. You have absolutely no legal right to barge into my private event and spread these ridiculous, slanderous lies to my business partners. I am calling the police. I will have you arrested for trespassing and corporate sabotage. I want you and this entire circus off my lawn this exact second before I forcefully remove you myself. Derek reached his hand out completely, intending to shove Bradley away from the silver microphone stand. But before his fingers could even graze the fabric of Bradley's suit, the fraud detective in the tan trench coat took one swift, highly calculated step forward. He placed his hand firmly onto the solid metal handle of his utility belt. Derek froze instantly, his false bravado crumbling into a pile of pathetic dust at the very sight of federal law enforcement stepping into his path. The remaining investors were watching the scene with morbid fascination, completely captivated by the total destruction of the young couple standing before them. I stepped out from behind my attorney. I walked slowly past Derek, not giving him the dignity of a single glance. I approached the microphone, gripping the metal stand with my left hand. In my right hand, I held up a small black object for the entire crowd to see. It was a portable Bluetooth speaker connected wirelessly to the cell phone hidden deep inside my suit pocket. I looked directly at Monica, who was trembling violently, her eyes darting frantically around the patio, looking for an escape route that did not exist. The silence returned to the patio, heavy and completely suffocating. Senile. I asked, my voice dangerously calm and echoing across the vast lawn. You claim that my brain is rotting. You claim that I do not know what is happening inside my own home. Let us test that theory. Let us listen to what my loving, devoted family talks about in the dark when I am supposedly asleep. I pressed my thumb firmly against the small play button on the side of the wireless speaker. For a brief, agonizing second, there was nothing but a soft hiss of static broadcasting through the high-fidelity outdoor sound system. And then the crystal-clear audio of my daughter-in-law filled the crisp morning air. Her voice, completely stripped of its fake, sugary sweetness, echoed violently across the silent patio. Did you put the crushed sedatives in his soup tonight? The recorded voice of Monica drifted over the manicured lawn, slicing through the tension like a sharpened blade. I watched the eyes of the wealthy investors widen in absolute shock. The older man with the leather portfolio, the one who had asked about my presence just moments ago, physically recoiled, taking a sudden step backward, as if the sound waves themselves had struck him right in the chest. Then Derek and his recorded voice answered her over the speaker. Yes, I put them in the soup just like we agreed. I ground up 3 pills and mixed them into the broth before I brought the tray into the study. A collective, horrifying gasp swept through the crowd of venture capitalists. Women covered their mouths with perfectly manicured hands. Men exchanged terrified, bewildered glances with their business partners. But the recording was not even close to being finished. I let the audio continue to play, forcing every single person on that patio to bear witness to the profound depths of their depravity. If he does not start acting like a severe dementia patient by tomorrow afternoon, the concierge doctor is not going to sign the final medical evaluation. The recorded, Monica hissed through the speakers. We cannot just claim he is losing his mind. We need to physically prove he is completely incapable of managing his own estate. The beautiful morning felt suddenly suffocating. I stared directly at my son. Derek was trembling violently, his eyes darting frantically around the patio as his own recorded words condemned him in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or claim the audio was completely fabricated, but the recording cut off any chance he had at a defense. The audio shifted smoothly to the intense argument they had inside the luxury vehicle after I ruined the forged insurance document. I did not just let him fall down those stairs by accident. Monica screamed through the speakers, her recorded voice vibrating with an uncontrollable, murderous fury. I rubbed a thick layer of industrial floor wax all over the top 3 wooden steps while he was asleep. I polished the wood until it was slick as pure ice. I did it so he would slip. I did it so he would fall backward and break his miserable neck. And the stubborn old bastard only managed to break his leg. The sheer malice in her confession washed over the patio, freezing everyone completely in place. Absolute horror painted the faces of the investors. These were men and women who dealt with corporate sabotage and ruthless financial maneuvers on a daily basis, but they were now standing face to face with a cold-blooded, premeditated, attempted murder. The elegant brunch they thought they were attending had suddenly transformed into a terrifying crime scene. The stern investor with the leather portfolio did not hesitate for another second. He snapped his folder shut with a loud, aggressive crack. He looked at Monica with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He grabbed his wife firmly by the elbow and turned his back on my son and my daughter-in-law. He began walking briskly toward the front gates without saying a single word to them. His sudden movement broke the paralyzing spell holding the rest of the crowd. Like a dam bursting, the entire group of wealthy venture capitalists immediately turned around and flooded toward the exit. They left their expensive champagne glasses resting on the cocktail tables. They abandoned their plates of gourmet food. They practically ran down the long circular driveway, eager to put as much distance as humanly possible between themselves and the massive criminal fraud scheme they had almost blindly funded. They realized instantly that lending millions of dollars to a pair of desperate criminals trying to murder an elderly man for his real estate would not just ruin their financial portfolios, it would drag them directly into a federal criminal investigation. Within less than 2 minutes, the lavish patio was entirely empty of guests. The beautiful string quartet had quickly packed up their expensive instruments and fled out the side gate. The hired catering staff retreated rapidly into the kitchen, desperately trying to avoid any involvement with the heavy law enforcement presence currently surrounding the perimeter. Only our small, tense group remained on the stone patio. I reached out and pressed the button on the speaker, ending the audio playback. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, saturated with the truth of their actions. Monica stood completely alone near the edge of the stone patio. The wealthy investors were gone. Her highly anticipated $5 million bridge loan had completely vanished into thin air. Her perfect upper-class aesthetic was permanently destroyed. Her face was contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of sheer panic. She looked around frantically, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. She realized there was no lie she could invent to save herself from her own confession. She saw the 2 uniformed police officers moving slowly toward her from the right side of the yard. Instinct took over her rational thought. She hiked up the fabric of her expensive white dress, spun around on her high heels, and made a desperate sprint toward the side gate leading out to the street. She was trying to run away from the inevitable consequences of her own horrific actions. But before she could take 3 steps, the detective blocked her path. The detective did not need to draw a weapon. He simply shifted his weight and stepped squarely into her path, his broad shoulders creating an impassable wall of authority. Monica slammed into his chest and bounced back, stumbling awkwardly on her designer heels. She fell hard onto the imported stone patio, scraping her knees and tearing the delicate fabric of her white dress. Before she could scramble back to her feet, the 2 uniformed police officers were upon her. They grabbed her arms with practiced efficiency. They hauled her up and twisted her wrists firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around her wrists echoed across the empty yard. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard in months. Monica completely lost whatever remained of her fragile composure. She began to thrash wildly against the officers, kicking her legs and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her perfect hair fell into her face in a tangled mess. The expensive necklace swung violently around her neck as she fought a futile battle against the inevitable reality of her own actions. The officers did not flinch. They held her securely in place, their faces carved from stone. When she finally realized that her physical resistance was entirely useless, the angry screaming abruptly morphed into pathetic sobbing. She hung her head, tears streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup, as the sheer weight of her impending prison sentence crashed down upon her shoulders. I turned my attention away from the sobbing woman and looked down at my son. Derek was watching his wife being restrained like a common criminal, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. The absolute finality of the situation finally pierced through his thick layer of arrogant delusion. He realized that the luxurious future he had plotted was gone. The $5 million loan, the beautiful estate, the massive inheritance, all of it had evaporated into thin air. He was entirely broke, heavily in debt, and standing directly in the crosshairs of a massive criminal investigation. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the hard stone patio, falling heavily onto his knees right in front of me. The sharp impact tore the fabric of his suit trousers, but he did not seem to notice or care. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat, and his eyes brimming with desperate, terrified tears. He clasped his trembling hands together and held them up toward my chest in a pathetic gesture of prayer. He was no longer the confident venture capitalist. He was a terrified, cornered animal desperately begging for a scrap of mercy. "Dad." "Please," Derek cried out, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure of his fear. "You have to stop them. Please, you have to tell them this is all a huge misunderstanding. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear on my life I never wanted any of this to happen. It was all her idea." He pointed a shaking finger directly at his wife, throwing her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. "She manipulated me into doing it. She controlled everything. She made me slip the pills into your food. She was the one who waxed the stairs. I was just trying to keep my marriage together. I love you, Dad. You have to believe me. Please do not let them take me away to prison. I am your only son." I stood there leaning slightly on my solid oak walking cane and looked down at the pathetic creature groveling at my feet. A father is supposed to feel a deep, agonizing heartbreak when he sees his child in pain. But as I looked into his desperate eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my forgiveness had run completely dry. I remembered the burning thirst in my throat. I remembered the sharp pain of my fractured leg. I remembered the cold, arrogant indifference he had shown me when I asked for a simple glass of water. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to his, ensuring that my words would be the very last thing he heard as a free man. "Get up and crawl out of my sight," I said, my voice dripping with absolute freezing contempt. "I am not your garbage man." Derek stared up at me with wide eyes. The absolute finality in my tone hit him harder than any blow could. He realized in that exact moment that the father he had known was dead. Before he could utter another pathetic word, the fraud detective stepped forward. He grabbed Derek firmly by the collar and hauled him roughly to his feet. Derek offered no physical resistance. His body went completely limp, his spirit broken by the crushing weight of his failure. The detective turned him around and pulled his arms behind his back. The second pair of steel handcuffs clicked shut, securing my son as firmly as his treacherous wife. Bradley Gibson stood silently by my side, watching the process with professional satisfaction. He gave a definitive nod to the officers. They began to march Derek and Monica away from the stone patio, guiding them down the circular driveway toward the iron gates. I watched them walk away, their heads hung low in ultimate defeat. The flashing red lights of the police cruisers reflected against the oak trees lining the street. The officers placed them into separate vehicles, shutting the heavy doors with a loud thud. The engines roared to life and the cars slowly rolled away, disappearing down the quiet road. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound silence. The catering staff had vanished. The investors were long gone. The lavish brunch was a ruined memory scattered across the lawn. I stood alone in the empty yard, gripping the handle of my cane, breathing the fresh morning air for the first time in months. 6 months passed since that beautiful Sunday morning on the patio. The crisp autumn air of Seattle had slowly transitioned into a cold, unrelenting winter and finally thawed into a mild, forgiving spring. I spent those months healing. My fractured leg fully recovered, allowing me to discard the heavy plaster cast and eventually leave the solid oak walking cane standing in the corner of my bedroom. But the physical healing was incredibly simple compared to the emotional severing I had to endure. The Grand Mercer Island estate was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful silence. I had successfully completely purged the venom from my home. Today I was sitting in the very back row of a sterile, brightly lit federal courtroom in downtown Seattle. The heavy wooden benches were uncomfortable, but I did not mind. I was here to witness the final chapter of their absolute destruction. The criminal trial had been a spectacular, highly publicized disaster for both of them. When faced with the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of the audio recordings and the forged medical documents, their united front completely shattered. They did not stand together in the face of adversity. Instead, they immediately turned on each other like starving feral animals trapped inside a tiny cage. It was genuinely pathetic to watch the total dissolution of their marriage play out in the public record. Monica hired a ruthless defense attorney using the absolute last of her depleted business funds. Her legal strategy was entirely built on painting my son as the sole mastermind of the entire operation. She sat on the witness stand, shedding copious amounts of fake tears, claiming she was a terrified, abused wife who was forced into participating in the fraudulent scheme. She swore under oath that Derek was the one who independently researched the poison and forced her to wax the stairs. Derek backed into a massive legal corner, retaliated with equal ferocity. His public defender produced endless strings of text messages and emails proving Monica was deeply in debt and completely desperate to secure the $5 million bridge loan. He painted her as a greedy, manipulative sociopath who preyed upon his inherent weakness and his deep desire to please her. He sobbed openly in the courtroom, begging the judge to understand that he was simply a pawn in her grand, malicious game. They spent weeks tearing each other to absolute shreds, completely destroying whatever fragile, transactional love they had ever shared. But the seasoned federal judge overseeing the case was not swayed by their pathetic theatrical displays. She saw right through their desperate finger-pointing. She looked down at them from her high wooden bench with an expression of profound, uncompromising disgust. The courtroom fell completely silent as she adjusted her reading glasses and prepared to deliver the final sentencing. She started with Monica. The judge explicitly noted the sheer malice and the terrifying level of premeditation required to rub industrial floor wax onto a wooden staircase with the specific intent to murder an elderly man. For the charges of attempted manslaughter, elder abuse, and severe financial fraud, Monica was sentenced to 8 consecutive years in a federal women's penitentiary, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Monica collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her loud, racking sobs echoing off the cold marble walls. Then the judge turned her sharp gaze directly toward my son. She told Derek that his crime was in many ways fundamentally worse than the crime of his wife. He had completely betrayed the sacred foundational trust of a parent. He had actively assisted in poisoning the very man who had given him life, provided for him, and bailed him out of his own financial failures. For his role as a willing accomplice to attempted manslaughter and corporate fraud, Derek was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Derek did not cry. He just stared blankly ahead, his spirit completely and utterly broken, his shoulders slumped in ultimate, irreversible defeat. I sat quietly in the back row, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumphant joy. I did not feel a renewed wave of agonizing sorrow. I looked at the man wearing the orange prison jumpsuit, the man who used to be my son, and I felt nothing but absolute cold closure. The toxic chapter of my life was officially over. The heavy burden I had carried for the last 6 months was finally lifted from my shoulders. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal gray suit, and turned my back on the courtroom. I did not wait to see them led away in heavy steel handcuffs. They were no longer my concern. I walked out the heavy double doors of the courtroom and stepped into the bright, bustling hallway. The air outside the courthouse was incredibly fresh. I walked down the wide concrete steps, my legs feeling strong and completely steady. The bustling city of Seattle moved rapidly around me, completely oblivious to the quiet victory I had just achieved. A sleek, black luxury town car was idling patiently by the curb, waiting specifically for me. The driver, a polite young man in a dark suit, immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. I slid into the comfortable leather seat, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over my mind. The driver closed the door, returning to the front seat. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, asking if I was ready to depart. I nodded slowly, telling him to drive. As the luxury car pulled smoothly away from the courthouse, merging seamlessly into the heavy afternoon traffic, I looked out the tinted window. The gray clouds above finally parted, revealing a bright patch of blue sky. I was leaving my painful past completely behind, heading boldly toward a brand new destination, and stepping proudly into a completely new, peaceful, and truly wonderful life. The luxury town car navigated the busy streets of downtown Seattle, with effortless grace carrying me further and further away from the heavy shadows of the federal courthouse. I watched the towering glass skyscrapers reflect the late afternoon sun, feeling a profound sense of lightness that I had not experienced in over a decade. The driver eventually pulled into the secure underground garage of a sleek, newly constructed high-rise building, nestled right in the vibrant heart of the city. This was my new home. After the arrests, I officially authorized Bradley Gibson to finalize the immediate transfer of the Mercer Island estate to the Veterans Charity. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with that massive house anymore. The charity had already begun transforming the sprawling grounds into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center for wounded soldiers. That beautiful property, which had briefly served as a terrifying prison for me, was now going to be a true place of healing for men and women who actually deserved it. I took a private elevator all the way up to the top floor, stepping directly into my new luxury penthouse. The space was absolutely magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire perimeter of the living room, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, the towering Space Needle, and the deep blue waters of the Puget Sound. The afternoon sunlight poured into the room, bathing the modern furniture and the polished hardwood floors in a warm golden glow. There were no dark corridors here. There were no wooden staircases hiding lethal traps. There was only light, open space, and absolute, undeniable peace. I walked across the living room without the slightest hint of a limp. My fractured leg had healed perfectly. Months of dedicated, intensive physical therapy had restored my physical strength completely, erasing the vulnerability that my son and his wife had so eagerly tried to exploit. I left my heavy wooden walking cane sitting in the umbrella stand by the front door. I no longer needed it for physical support, and I certainly no longer needed it for a theatrical performance. I was a whole man again, standing entirely on my own 2 feet. I walked smoothly into the pristine, minimalist kitchen. The marble countertops were immaculate and cool to the touch. I opened a high-glass cabinet and reached for a heavy crystal tumbler. I walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, pressed the glass against the dispenser, and listened to the gentle hum of the machine as crystal-clear, ice-cold water filled the cup to the absolute brim. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding the cold glass in my steady hand. I raised it to my lips and took a long, slow drink. The water felt incredibly cool and refreshing against my throat. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the simple, mundane action wash over me. I remembered the sheer, agonizing humiliation of that terrible morning so many months ago. I remembered sitting helplessly in my wheelchair, my leg throbbing in pure agony, my throat burning with desperate thirst. I remembered Monica telling me to get down on the floor and crawl like a dog just for a single drop of water. I remembered Derek turning his back on me, pretending he could not hear my suffering. That single glass of water had been the catalyst for the total destruction of my family. But now standing in my sunlit penthouse pouring my own water. With my own strong hands, the liquid tasted like pure, unadulterated freedom. It tasted like absolute victory. I walked over to the massive windows and looked down at the tiny cars moving along the busy streets far below. A profound sense of clarity settled over my mind. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are taught from a very young age that family is the absolute most important thing in the world, that we must forgive our relatives for their trespasses, no matter how deep the wounds they inflict upon us. But I have learned the incredibly hard way that blood means absolutely nothing if it is laced with venom. A father's love should be a shield, not a blindfold. For far too many years, I allowed my unconditional love for Derek to completely blind me to his glaring flaws, his rampant greed, and his ultimate lack of basic human empathy. I enabled his terrible behavior by constantly bailing him out of his self-inflicted financial disasters, hoping that my generosity would eventually teach him responsibility. Instead, it only taught him exactly how to be a more efficient parasite. When they crossed the ultimate line, when they actively plotted to steal my wealth and extinguish my life, I had to make a terrifying choice. I chose dignity over a toxic illusion of family. I chose to survive, and I do not regret my decision for a single second. Letting go of the people who are actively destroying you is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Being alone in this beautiful, quiet penthouse with my self-respect fully intact is infinitely better than being surrounded by a family that smiles to my face while silently waiting for me to take my final breath. I built my empire through hard work, intelligence, and uncompromising standards. I will spend the rest of my days enjoying the fruits of my lifelong labor exactly as I see fit, without ever looking over my shoulder again. Do you think I was too harsh in sending my own son to prison? Or did they get exactly what they deserved? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of surviving the unimaginable. Thank you for listening to my story today. Until next time, stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone steal your dignity.